Okay, imagine this. You're on a ship.
Oh, this sounds intense already.
It is. It's a resupply ship in the South China Sea, and you're trying to reach this tiny outpost with like essential supplies, food, water, everything.
Right.
Out of nowhere, Chinese Coast Guard ships show up.
Oh, no.
And suddenly you're facing down water cannons.
Seriously?
Yeah,
Water cannons.
this isn't some action movie. This is the reality in the South China Sea. And
Wow.
this is why we're doing a deep dive today on this strategically vital waterway.
Vital is an understatement. And it's not just strategic. We're talking about trillions of dollars.
Yeah.
Trillions in trade flowing through there every year. I mean, think about it. It's about 3 times the size of the entire German economy.
That's wild.
If that gets disrupted, the whole world feels it.
Okay, that puts it into perspective.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the potential for things to escalate.
Yeah.
What exactly does that look like? What makes this particular body of water such a global flashpoint?
Well, think about it. You've got these trade routes and fishing grounds on the surface.
Right.
But underneath it all, you've got this tangled web of competing claims. You've got 6 nations all claiming parts of the South China Sea.
6.
Yeah, China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, the Philippines, and Taiwan.
Wow. So it's not just a two-sided thing.
No, not at all. It's a whole mix of history, resources, strategic interests, all fueling these overlapping claims.
Okay, you brought a ton of research to this deep dive, and I got to say, the historical aspect always gets me. Where do we even begin with all of this?
Let's start with a map.
Okay.
Specifically a map from 1947
Okay.
from China. They call it the 9-dash line.
9-dash line. Why that name?
Well, because it literally has 9 dashes on it.
Okay.
And these dashes, they basically make this huge loop around a big chunk of the South China Sea.
So they're claiming all of that.
Yeah, the problem is a lot of those areas are claimed by other countries as their exclusive economic zones.
Hold on, exclusive economic zone. What's that?
It's basically like a country's backyard.
A backyard.
Yeah, extending out from their coastline. And within that zone, they have special rights to explore and use the resources there. So fishing, oil, gas, all that.
So China's saying, this whole backyard is mine, even though other countries are saying, no, it's ours?
That's the gist of it. Yeah. And to make things even more complicated, in 2016, a UN-backed court actually sided with the Philippines.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in a case challenging those historical claims.
So the UN said China's claim isn't valid.
Exactly. They said it has no legal basis, but China has completely ignored that ruling.
Okay, so we've got this historical baggage competing claims, and a UN ruling that one side just ignores. What could possibly go wrong?
A lot, unfortunately. And that brings us back to that incident you mentioned earlier with the water cannons.
Right, the one with the Philippine ship.
Exactly. That took place at a spot called the Second Thomas Shoal.
And that's where the Philippines has that World War II era ship, the Sierra Madre, intentionally run aground. What's the point of that?
It's actually a pretty clever strategy. It acts as a physical marker of their claim to the shoal.
Oh, I see.
And it provides a base for a small group of Filipino troops.
So it's like a symbol of their determination to hold on to that territory.
Exactly. It's a powerful symbol. But the problem is it needs regular resupply. And China tries to block that sometimes using tactics like those water cannons.
It's like a high-stakes game of chicken playing out in the middle of this incredibly important shipping lane.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way to put it. And this is one of the big reasons why the U.S. is so concerned about what's happening in the South China Sea.
Right. It's not just about protecting the Philippines, though, is it? They have that mutual defense treaty, but there's a bigger picture here.
You got it. The U.S. sees the South China Sea as essential for global trade and security.
Right.
They believe in upholding freedom of navigation for everyone, not just for themselves.
Makes sense.
And they want to see smaller nations like the Philippines able to assert their rights without being bullied by a bigger neighbor.
Okay, but China hasn't just been sitting back passively. They've been transforming the entire landscape with their island building campaign.
You're absolutely right. It's one thing to draw lines on a map. It's another thing entirely to actually build islands and then fortify them with military installations.
It's like a real-life game of Risk.
Exactly.
They're turning these reefs and shoals into artificial islands with airstrips, listening posts, the whole 9 yards.
And then you add in the constant presence of their Navy and Coast Guard.
It's like they're saying, this is our territory and we're here to stay.
That's the message they're sending. And it's created a lot of anxiety, not just in the region, but internationally.
Speaking of anxiety, the Philippines' approach towards China has been interesting to watch. Their previous president, Duterte, seemed to favor closer ties with China.
He did. He downplayed the territorial disputes,
Right.
hoping to attract Chinese investment.
Okay.
He even basically set aside that UN ruling we talked about.
Wow.
But the current president, Marcos Jr., seems to be going in a different direction.
Yeah, he seems much more assertive.
Much more. He's prioritizing closer ties with the U.S., and he's pushing back against Chinese actions more forcefully.
He's not shying away from the conflict.
Nope. He's even invited journalists to witness those confrontations firsthand.
It's like he's saying, see for yourselves what's happening here.
Exactly. He wants the world to pay attention, and he's backing it up with action. He's granted the U.S. access to 4 additional military bases in the Philippines.
4 more.
Yeah. And 3 of those are really strategically important because of how close they are to Taiwan.
Which, of course, adds another layer of complexity to this whole geopolitical puzzle.
Oh, yeah. It gets even more complicated from here.
I bet it does.
Oh.
This is already a lot to take in.
And we're just getting started.
Well, let's dive deeper into all of this after a quick break.
Sounds good.
We'll be right back.
Hey.
Okay, so we're talking potential flashpoints, military buildups, shifting alliances. It's a lot to process.
It is.
But I'm curious, with all these moving pieces, what role could the U.S. actually play if things boil over in the South China Sea?
Well, that really comes down to the Mutual Defense Treaty between the U.S. and the Philippines.
Right, from way back.
Yeah, it dates back to 1951. But what exactly triggers U.S. involvement has always been a bit murky.
Okay.
Recently, though, there have been much clearer statements from the U.S. Any attack on Philippine aircraft vessels or armed forces in the South China Sea would invoke that treaty.
So that includes those troops stationed on that grounded ship, the Sierra Madre.
Absolutely. So if those water cannons were to escalate to something more serious, the U.S. could be legally obligated to respond.
Wow, the stakes are incredibly high. It's like a tripwire for a much larger conflict.
Yeah, you could say that.
But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the other nations in the region, especially those in Southeast Asia. They seem caught between a rock and a hard place.
They are. They rely on both the U.S. and China for trade and security.
So how do they navigate that?
It's a delicate balancing act, trying to maintain good relations with both sides without being forced to choose.
Can you give us an example of what that looks like in practice?
Sure, take Vietnam, for instance.
Okay.
They have their own territorial disputes with China in the South China Sea. So they understand the Philippines' concerns, but at the same time, China is a major trading partner for them.
One they can't afford to alienate.
Exactly. So it's this constant calculation of risks and rewards.
And it's not just Vietnam, right?
No. Many Southeast Asian nations are in a similar position. They rely heavily on trade with both China and the U.S.
Right.
And they also benefit from the security umbrella that the U.S. provides in the region. So they're walking this tightrope, trying to safeguard their own interests without becoming collateral damage in a bigger conflict.
We've painted a pretty intense picture so far.
Mm-hmm.
Competing claims, military buildups, a region on edge. Is there any hope for de-escalation?
There are some glimmers of hope.
Okay, good.
Despite the tension, both the U.S. and China have been trying to keep lines of communication open.
So they're talking.
Yes. There have been high-level meetings between military officials, signaling a desire to avoid a catastrophic confrontation.
That's encouraging.
It is. But the risk of miscalculation is always there. Even a seemingly minor incident could spiral out of control.
Like what?
Imagine a collision between a U.S. and Chinese warship, for example.
Oh.
What starts as an accident could easily escalate into something much more dangerous, especially given the heightened tensions and mistrust.
So it's like walking through a minefield blindfolded.
That's a powerful image, and it underscores why diplomacy and a willingness to find common ground are so crucial. The alternative, a full-blown conflict in the South China Sea, would be disastrous for everyone.
Absolutely. But how do you find common ground when the core issues are so deeply entrenched?
It won't be easy. But it starts with understanding the motivations and anxieties of all sides.
Okay, so break that down for us.
For China, it's about securing what they see as their historical territory and projecting their power. For the U.S., it's about upholding international law and ensuring freedom of navigation. And for the smaller nations in the region, it's about surviving and prospering in the shadow of these giants.
We've talked a lot about the geopolitical chessboard, but I'm also curious about the human element. What's life like for the people living in these disputed areas?
That's a crucial aspect that often gets overlooked.
Yeah.
For fishermen, for example, the increasing tensions have made their livelihoods more dangerous and unpredictable. They're literally caught in the middle, trying to fish in waters that have become heavily militarized.
Wow, I hadn't thought about that.
And for the families of those soldiers stationed on that grounded ship, the constant threat of confrontation must be incredibly stressful.
It's a reminder that behind these abstract geopolitical maneuvers, there are real people whose lives are directly impacted.
Absolutely. And that human cost should never be forgotten.
Okay, so we've covered the historical claims, the military buildups, the alliances, the risk of miscalculation. It's a lot to take in.
It is.
But I'm wondering, is there a way to connect all of this to something a little closer to home? Something our listeners can really grasp?
Well, remember when we talked about the potential for disrupted trade routes?
Right, the trillions of dollars worth of goods that flow through the South China Sea.
Exactly. Imagine a scenario where tensions escalate to the point where shipping companies are forced to reroute their vessels.
Okay,
Or worse, suspend operations altogether.
that would be bad.
It would. That disruption could have a ripple effect throughout the global economy. We could see shortages of essential goods, skyrocketing prices, even economic recession.
So it's not just about some far-off territorial dispute.
Mhm.
It could actually hit us in the wallet.
It could.
Yeah.
And that's why it's in everyone's best interest to find a peaceful resolution to this conflict.
You mentioned earlier that this whole situation feels like a countdown to a potential conflict. How close are we to that clock hitting zero?
It's impossible to say for sure, but there are certain indicators that we can look at. The pace of China's military buildup is certainly concerning.
In what way?
They're developing and deploying advanced weapon systems like hypersonic missiles and aircraft carriers that are specifically designed to challenge U.S. dominance in the region.
So they're not just building up their defenses, they're developing offensive capabilities that could directly threaten U.S. interests.
That's right. And that's why the U.S. is so concerned. They see China's actions as a direct challenge to their long-standing dominance in the region.
And that brings us back to the Mutual Defense Treaty with the Philippines. If China were to directly attack a U.S. base in the Philippines, would that automatically trigger U.S. involvement?
It's not entirely clear. The treaty language is somewhat ambiguous.
Okay.
And there's been debate about whether it applies to attacks on U.S. forces stationed on foreign soil. But given the recent statements we discussed earlier, it's likely that any attack on U.S. forces in the Philippines would be met with a swift and forceful response.
It sounds like we're entering a dangerous new phase in this conflict.
We are, and that's why it's more important than ever to have informed and engaged citizens who understand the complexities of this issue
Right.
and demand that their leaders prioritize diplomacy and peaceful solutions.
Speaking of complexities, we haven't even touched on the role of Taiwan in all of this. How does Taiwan fit into this already complicated equation?
Taiwan is watching the situation in the South China Sea very closely. They see it as a potential preview of what they might face if China ever decides to assert its claim over Taiwan by force. If the U.S. fails to back up the Philippines in a conflict with China, it could embolden China to take a more aggressive stance toward Taiwan.
So Taiwan is looking at the Philippines as a test case for U.S. resolve.
In a way, yes. And that's why Taiwan is strengthening its own defenses and seeking closer ties with the U.S. and other like-minded countries.
Okay.
They understand that their fate is intertwined with the broader regional dynamics and that the outcome of these disputes in the South China Sea could have profound consequences for their own future.
It's like a series of dominoes all lined up and waiting for the first one to fall.
That's a good analogy. And it highlights the interconnectedness of these regional security issues. What happens in the South China Sea doesn't stay in the South China Sea. It has implications for Taiwan, for Japan, for South Korea, even for countries farther afield.
So if we're talking about potential flashpoints, the South China Sea isn't the only one we need to be watching.
Not at all. The Taiwan Strait is another potential flashpoint, and the situation there is becoming increasingly tense as well.
This is getting really complicated. We've got the South China Sea, Taiwan, the U.S., China, and all these other countries caught in the middle. It's like a giant tangled web.
It is complex. But that's why it's so important to break it down and try to understand the underlying dynamics, because at the end of the day, this isn't just some abstract geopolitical game. Real people's lives are at stake.
I'm glad you brought that up. We've talked a lot about the military aspects and the strategic calculations, but what about the human cost of all of this? What happens to the people who live in these disputed areas if conflict breaks out?
The consequences would be devastating. We could see mass displacement, widespread casualties, and a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. And even if the fighting is contained, the economic and social impacts would be felt far and wide.
It's a sobering thought.
It is. And it's a reminder that we need to do everything in our power to prevent this conflict from happening.
We talked earlier about the importance of diplomacy, but what specifically could be done to de-escalate the situation?
One important step would be for all parties to agree to a code of conduct for the South China Sea.
A code of conduct.
Yes. This would establish clear rules for behavior and help to reduce the risk of miscalculation. It's been in talks for years, but China has been reluctant to sign on to anything that would limit their actions.
So it sounds like we're stuck in a bit of a stalemate, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around this whole idea of a code of conduct.
Hmm.
What would that actually look like in practice?
Well, it could include things like prior notification of military exercises, agreements on fishing rights, and mechanisms for resolving disputes peacefully. The goal would be to create a more predictable and stable environment, reducing the likelihood of accidental clashes.
It sounds like a sensible approach, but given the level of mistrust between the parties, I imagine it would be incredibly difficult to negotiate and implement.
You're right. It would require a significant amount of goodwill and a willingness to compromise on all sides, which seems to be in short supply at the moment. But it's still worth pursuing because the alternative is too dangerous to contemplate.
This has been incredibly informative. I feel like I'm starting to understand the complexities of this situation a lot better,
Mm.
but I'm also feeling a bit overwhelmed by it all. It's like a giant puzzle box, and every time we open a new layer, we find even more intricate mechanisms and potential consequences. It's a bit daunting, to be honest.
I understand. It is a lot to process, but that's why it's so important to have these conversations and to try to make sense of this complex issue, because the more we understand about what's at stake, the better equipped we are to demand peaceful solutions from our leaders.
I agree, and I think that's a good place to wrap up this part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still much more to explore. It's tricky, right? These Southeast Asian nations, they're caught in the middle of this superpower rivalry.
Oh, absolutely. It's like walking a diplomatic tightrope,
Yeah.
trying to stay on good terms with both the US and China without making either one angry.
Yeah, earlier you mentioned Vietnam having to do that. Are there other specific examples of these kinds of dilemmas these nations face?
For sure, take Malaysia. They've traditionally had strong economic ties with China, but they also depend on the US for security cooperation, particularly in maritime security.
So they need China for business, but the U.S. for protection.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And then you have countries like Indonesia, the biggest economy in Southeast Asia. They're trying to chart their own course.
Stay neutral.
Yeah, they don't want to get dragged into a conflict that doesn't directly benefit them.
It's almost like they're trying to build a bridge between two tectonic plates that are constantly shifting and grinding against each other.
That's a great analogy. They're trying to find that sweet spot where they can use their relationships with both superpowers to their advantage without getting crushed in the process.
We've talked about the potential for conflict, but what would actually cause these Southeast Asian nations to get involved?
Well, one scenario is a conflict between the US and China that spills over into the region, maybe a confrontation over Taiwan.
Right.
These nations could find themselves being pressured to choose sides.
This is a nightmare for them.
Totally. Another possibility is that the conflict in the South China Sea itself escalates, pulling in neighboring countries.
Because of treaty obligations?
Right. Or simply because they're so close.
Like a brush fire spreading.
Exactly. And even if they manage to avoid direct military involvement, they could still face serious consequences. Economic fallout, social upheaval,
Disrupted trade.
absolutely, an influx of refugees, even cyber attacks.
So it's not just about picking sides in a war. It's about the broader impact on their stability and their well-being.
You got it. And that's why it's so important to consider their perspectives and understand the tough choices they're facing.
It reminds us that these conflicts that seem far away can actually have ripple effects that touch everyone.
For sure. It really underscores how important diplomacy and dialogue are, and a commitment to peaceful solutions. The stakes are just too high for things to get out of control.
So we've covered a lot today. The South China Sea has become this flashpoint with historical claims, military buildups, and a web of alliances making any misstep potentially disastrous.
It's complicated. There are no easy answers. But by understanding the motivations of the key players, China, the US, and the Southeast Asian nations in the middle, we can grasp how serious this situation is.
And that's what this deep dive is all about, right? Giving our listeners the knowledge they need to understand this complex world.
Exactly. And as you follow this situation, I want you to consider this. In this age of technology, how might artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons make things even more complicated in the South China Sea?
AI and autonomous weapons. We're already dealing with a powder keg as it is.
Think about it. We've already seen China investing heavily in these technologies. Their use could create a situation where decisions are being made by algorithms, not humans.
And that could speed up the conflict.
Potentially, and make it even harder to de-escalate.
It's like pouring gasoline on a fire.
Exactly. It makes clear communication and finding diplomatic solutions even more urgent.
We've learned so much today about the forces at play in the South China Sea and why this matters to everyone. Thanks for guiding us through this.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, staying informed is the first step towards finding solutions. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep having thoughtful discussions about these critical issues.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, stay curious.